Welcome to Late Night Calm. Let the lights go low now. Wherever you are, however you're lying, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There's nothing to solve tonight. There's nowhere you have to be. All you have to do is breathe, and let a very old world assemble itself slowly around you, one soft layer at a time, the way a city appears out of morning fog. Take a slow breath in, and let it go. Good, we have all the time in the world. Tonight we're going to walk, together and unhurried, up through the levels of one of the longest-lived empires the world has ever known, the empire of the House of Osman. A dynasty that ruled without a break for more than 600 years, from around the year 1299 all the way to 1922. 6 centuries. Think of that as a single, enormous house with many, many floors, and tonight you get to be the guest who is allowed to climb the staircase, floor by floor, and simply look. You won't have to remember anything. The names will drift past like boats on dark water. Let them. But before we climb, I want to tell you something strange. Something that, once you understand it, changes the shape of everything you'll see tonight. It's the secret hidden inside the whole structure, and it runs against almost everything we expect about power. Here it is. The men who ran this empire, the men who governed its provinces, who commanded its armies, who managed its treasury and sat at the very right hand of the ruler, were, very nearly every one of them, slaves, not free-born nobles, not lords with ancient family names and inherited castles. Slaves, men who were, in the eyes of the law, the personal property of the ruler. And here is the part that turns the whole thing upside down and makes it beautiful in a cold, clockwork way. That was not a flaw in the system. That was the reason the system worked. They could be trusted with such staggering power precisely because they were owned. Sit with that for a moment. In the world most of us imagine, you rise by being born high, by having land, a name, relatives, a lineage that stretches back through the generations. Here it was almost the reverse. Here, having nothing and no one was the qualification. A man with land could plot. A man with a great family could dream of a throne of his own. A man with sons could imagine a dynasty. But a slave taken from a distant village as a child, converted, raised inside the palace, with no property that wasn't a gift, no family that wasn't left behind, no roots anywhere in the world except the ruler himself, that man could be handed an army. Because where would he run? To whom would he be loyal, except the one person who had made him everything he was? The word for such a man was kul. It's a soft little word. Say it slowly to yourself. Kul, and it means slave, or bondsman, the servant of the sultan. And the great standing troops and officials who formed the core of this slave elite had their own name, the kapkulu, which means, quite literally, the slaves of the gate, the slaves of the porti, the doorway of government. The whole ruling machine of the empire was, in its bones, the ruler's own household of slaves, simply scaled up until it was large enough to run a world. So keep that in your mind, gently, like a coin held loosely in an open palm, as we begin to climb. Ownership and elevation in this world were the same thing. The higher you rose, the more completely you belonged to someone. And this is the promise of our whole journey tonight, the thread you can follow up all the stairs. The higher you climbed, the closer death came to sit beside you. At the very bottom, life was hard, but death came slowly, in the ordinary way of hunger and season and age. At the very top, death was quiet and swift and could arrive on a silver dish or at the end of a silk cord on a morning that had started like any other. We are climbing toward danger tonight, floor by floor. But you, the guest, are safe. You only get to watch. Let me show you where this promise becomes real. Let me take you to a morning in the year 1595. The palace is quiet in the way that only a very great building can be quiet, a silence made of thick walls and marble floors, and thousands of people who have all learned to move without sound. And out of that palace, on this particular morning, a small procession comes. It is carrying coffins. Small coffins. 19 of them. The number is worth letting land. 19. They are being carried through the streets so that the city can see them, and inside them are the brothers of the man who has just become sultan. 19 brothers. Some of them, the accounts tell us, were still infants. All of them had been strangled, put to death quietly with a cord, so that one man could take the throne and rule without the threat of a rival rising up behind him. 19 small coffins carried out into the light. It is one of the most quietly terrible images the records have left us, and I tell it to you not to frighten you. You are warm, you are safe, this is centuries and centuries away, but because it opens the door to the very top floor of our house. Because that act, monstrous as it feels to us, was not a crime in that world. It was law. It had a name and a logic and a written justification, and understanding why it existed is the first step in understanding the man at the summit of everything, the Sultan. So let us climb, at last, to the top. Let us stand quietly at a respectful distance before the Padilla himself. Padilla. That is one of his titles, and it means, roughly, Emperor, Master King, the sovereign above all other sovereigns. But it is another of his honorifics that tells you the true nature of what he was, and I want you to hear it slowly, because it is one of the most beautiful and strange phrases in the whole language of power. Zilullah fil lem. The shadow of God on earth. Turn that phrase over gently in the dark. The shadow of God on earth. Now, and this is important, so let it settle, this was not a claim that the Sultan was a god. That's not what a shadow is. Think of what a shadow actually is. A shadow is the shape a thing casts when light falls on it. It isn't the thing itself. It's the dark, cool imprint the thing leaves upon the ground. So to call the Sultan the shadow of God on earth was to say that his authority was not his own. It was cast down from above, the way your own shadow is cast down onto the pavement on a bright day. A shape thrown by a far greater light, falling across the world of men. His justice, his command, the very order of his empire. All of it was understood as the earthly shade of a divine order standing far overhead. He ruled in this vision so that the world below could rest in the cool shadow of a justice larger than any one man. And so in theory, and this is the fact I most want you to carry up the stairs with you, this one man was the owner of the entire ruling class, as if they were the members of his own personal household. Those slave governors, those slave generals, the whole apparatus of the Kapkulu, all of it was, in the deepest legal sense, his household. His to raise up, his to strike down. His power grew too over the centuries in a way worth pausing on. After the year 1517, the Sultan claimed the guardianship of the two holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Let that add its weight to the figure standing before us. He was not only an emperor of vast lands and many peoples, he was also, now, the protector of the sacred places at the very heart of a faith shared by millions. The shadow of God on earth and the guardian of the ground where the faith was born. You begin to feel how enormous this single human being was made to seem. how the whole world was arranged to point up toward him, the way the streets of an old city all seemed to bend, eventually toward the great mosque at its center. But here is where the shadow grows cold. Here is where we return to those 19 coffins. Because a throne this great, in a world without a clear, simple rule for who inherited it, was a terribly dangerous prize. When a sultan died, he might leave behind several sons, and every one of those sons could, in principle, make a claim. And in the past, before the rule we're about to meet, that had meant something dreadful. Civil war. Brother against brother, the empire tearing itself in half, while rival princes raised armies, and the lands burned. The people suffered. The frontier weakened. The whole house shook on its foundations. So one sultan looked at that danger and made a decision of terrible icy clarity. That sultan was Mehmed II, the same ruler who in 1453 had conquered the great city of Constantinople and made it his own. He was a man who thought in systems, in laws, in the long machinery of the state. And into his book of laws, his Kanun-Nam, his written code of secular royal law, he set down a rule that historians have come to call the law of fratricide. Fratricide, the killing of a brother. The words he used were plain and chilling in their calm. Whichever of his sons should inherit the throne, the law allowed, may fittingly put his brothers to death, for the good order of the world. For the good order of the world. Read it again in your mind, slowly. It was not framed as cruelty. It was framed as mercy, a smaller, contained horror, chosen deliberately to prevent a far larger one. Kill the few at the very start, quietly, so that the many will not die later in the fields and the burning towns. One prince takes the throne, his brothers are put to death, and the empire does not tear itself apart. That was the logic. It was arithmetic written in blood, and it was law. And so we understand now that morning in 1595. When Mehmed III came to the throne, he acted according to this written law, and 19 of his brothers, some of them infants, were strangled and their small coffins carried out through the streets. It was not a fit of madness. It was, horribly, the system doing exactly what it was designed to do, spending a few small lives to buy the peace of the whole. This is what I meant when I promised you that the higher you climb, the closer death sits. Here, at the very summit, on the day of a man's greatest triumph, death walked through the nursery. Breathe, now, let your chest rise and fall. This is long ago. These are shadows on old water. You are only watching from a great and gentle distance, and no harm can reach you here. Let the horror soften into history, the way a sharp stone at the bottom of a stream is worn smooth by the slow, patient current of years. Because the story does not stay there. The system, in time, softened its own edge, though the softer version, as you'll see, carried its own strange sorrow. Around the year 1603, the empire turned away from the killing of princes and put something else in its place. And this is one of the quietest, most melancholy corners of our whole house, so let us step into it softly. Instead of being put to death, the Sultan's brothers and sons, the princes who might one day rule, and who might, on any other day, be rivals, were now shut away. Confined, kept in a set of guarded apartments deep within the palace, in a place that came to be called the kafes. The word means the cage. The cage. Picture it, but gently, the way you'd picture a room in a dream. A prince, a young man who might one day be the shadow of God on earth, is placed inside a comfortable prison at the heart of the palace. He is not chained, he is not starved, he has servants and rooms and food and a kind of muffled luxury. But he is cut off from the world completely. He cannot ride out freely, he cannot govern a province, or lead men, or learn the hard practical business of ruling. He simply waits in beautiful, padded silence, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. And think of what that did. A man could grow from youth into middle age inside those rooms, never once making a real decision, never commanding anyone, never living as a free adult lives. And then, one day, the throne might come to him. Because the Sultan died, and this confined man was the eldest of the line, and he would step blinking out of the cage and into the most powerful office on earth, having spent his whole life learning nothing but how to wait. It is no wonder the records tell us of unstable reigns, of sultans unready for the weight suddenly set upon them. The cage had spared their lives, yes, but it had taken almost everything else. It had, in a sense, kept the body alive and quietly hollowed out the man. So you see the shape of it now, the terrible symmetry at the top of our house. In the old way, the brothers died so that one could rule. In the new way, the brothers lived, but lived as ghosts in a gilded cage so that one could rule. Either way, the throne was surrounded by a kind of death, the death of the body or the slow death of a life never truly lived. The summit was never a place of pure safety. It was the loneliest and most dangerous room in the whole enormous house. Let me show you, now, what it actually felt like to be near the very center of that room, because the strangeness only deepens the closer you get to the Sultan himself. Come with me, in your imagination, into the deepest part of the palace, the great palace called Topkap. A vast complex of courtyards and gardens and chambers laid out along the shore where the waters meet. It was built as a series of courts, each one more private, more guarded, more silent than the last, so that passing inward through the palace was like passing inward through the layers of a great secret. The outer courts held the business of the world, the councils, the crowds, the petitioners. But as you moved deeper, past the gates, into the inner courts, the noise fell away, and away, and away, until you reached a place where the ordinary sounds of human life simply were not permitted. In that inner world, silence was not an accident. It was a law. It was a discipline cultivated on purpose, so that the sacred hush around the ruler's person was never broken. The Sultan often ate alone, in that deep quiet, a solitary figure at his meal, surrounded not by chatter, but by stillness. And to keep the secrets and the silence of that inner palace, there existed one of the most extraordinary corps of servants in the whole empire. They were called the Dilsiz. The word means the tongueless, the mute ones. They were deaf and mute servants of the palace, and they had developed among themselves a language made entirely of signs, of gestures and looks, a silent tongue spoken with the hands. Think of how perfect and how eerie that was, in a place where every overheard word could be a danger, where secrets were currency, and a loose tongue could cost a life. Here were men who could not repeat what they saw, and who spoke to one another in a language of moving hands that made no sound at all. The most sensitive conversations of the empire could take place with these servants standing right there in the room, and the secrets were safe, because the messengers were sealed. They moved through the marble halls like a soft-footed silence, given human shape. But the Dilsiz carried something else, too, and here the cold shadow returns one last time to the top of our house. Because these same silent men were sometimes the ones who carried out the Sultan's most intimate sentences of death. When a high official was to be executed, quietly, without the mess and spectacle of a public blade, it was sometimes done with a bowstring, a cord, drawn tight, and it was sometimes these mute servants who were sent to do it. Imagine the terrible completeness of that image. A man of great rank receives, in the hush of the palace, a visit from figures who cannot speak, who bring with them a length of cord and a message that needs no words at all. The silence that protected the Sultan's secrets was the same silence in which his sentences were carried out. At the very top of the house, even death moved on quiet feet and spoke with its hands and left no echo. You will notice, as we climb tonight, that this is the pattern woven through every floor. Beauty and danger, elevation and ownership, the gift and the cord, always braided together. The green gardens of the palace, and the silent men with the bowstring, the shadow of God on earth, and 19 small coffins. It was a world of extraordinary order, and the price of that order was paid, at every level, in a currency of fear and loyalty and belonging. And nowhere was that truer than here, at the summit, where a single man sat as the shadow of the divine, owning the whole ruling class as his household, and where the throne he sat upon was ringed, always, by the quiet nearness of death. Now, let your body grow a little heavier into whatever holds you. We have stood at the top. We have seen the Sultan in his silent inner court, the guardian of the holy cities, the shadow cast down from a greater light, and we have seen the cost sown into his greatness, the fratricide law written plainly in the old code, the cage that spared the body and stole the life, the tongueless men gliding through the marble with their cord. That is the apex of our house. That is the highest floor, and the most dangerous. But an empire is not one man, however great. A single human being, however he is called the shadow of God, cannot govern provinces stretching across 3 continents, cannot read every petition, cannot sit in judgment on every dispute or count every coin in every treasury. The Sultan was the summit, the still point, the sacred centre around which everything turned. But the actual turning, the day-to-day labour of making an empire run, that fell to other hands, powerful hands, hands that held a seal. And so, as your breathing slows and the palace grows dim and warm around you, let us begin to step down, just 1 floor, from the silent Sultan to the man who stood closest below him, the man who actually ran the state. Because if the Sultan was the shadow of God, resting at the still centre, then this next man was the one who carried the weight of the whole world's business on his own shoulders day after day, knowing all the while that the same cord, the same silver dish, the same quiet visit from tongueless men waited for him too, should he ever fail, or fall from favour, or simply become inconvenient. He wore the Sultan's own seal on a cord around his own neck. And to understand him, to understand what it meant to hold that seal, and to govern an empire while your own head was never entirely your own, we must look closely at the 2nd floor of our great house, just below the summit. But that is where we are going next, and there is no need to hurry toward it. Let the image of the seal hang there for now, glinting softly in the dark, a small, heavy object worn against the skin, at once the greatest honour the empire could give, and the surest mark of how far there was to fall. For now, simply rest here, on the threshold between the highest floor and the next. Let the silence of the inner court settle over you like a heavy, warm blanket. The Sultan eats alone in his hush. The princes wait in their gilded cage. The tongueless men move through the marble like slow water. And far below, the great house stands, floor upon floor, each one a life, each one a story, all of them waiting patiently for us to visit them, one soft step at a time. Breathe in, slowly, and out. There is nothing left tonight but the climbing down, gentle and unhurried, through this old and ordered world. And we have only just begun. Go back up with me, though, just once more, before we take the first step down. Stand again in that highest room, and let us give the man who lives there his full name, the whole heavy string of it, the way a herald might have unrolled it in a throne room hung with gold. He was the Padea, the emperor, the master king, the word itself older than the empire and borrowed from the Persian kings who came before. And after the year 1517, when the holy cities of the desert passed into his keeping, he became something more than a conqueror of lands. He became the guardian of Mecca and of Medina, the protector of the two sanctuaries toward which, 5 times a day, half the known world turned its face to pray. Imagine holding that. Not owning it, exactly. No man could own those places, but standing as their sworn keeper, so that every pilgrim crossing the sand was, in some small way, crossing ground you were bound to protect. And then the title that we have circled once already, but which deserves to be turned over slowly in the hand like a smooth stone in the dark. Zilullah fil Lem, the shadow of God on earth. Hear how careful that phrase is. Not God. Not a God. Not even a man who speaks for God. A shadow. A shade that a great light casts across the ground when something stands between the sun and the dust. The Sultan did not claim the light. He claimed to be the shape the light made when it fell across the world, the place where divine order touched the soil and became roads and courts and armies and grain in the storehouse. To stand in his shadow was to stand, for a moment, in a coolness that the whole ordered heavens had leaned down to make. It is a strange and enormous idea to hold in the mind as you drift, this notion of a single living man understood as the earthly shadow of the sky's own government. And because he was that shadow, everything beneath him belonged, in the end, to him. Not only the land, and not only the treasure, the men themselves, the generals in their tents, the governors in their far provinces, the judges, the scribes, the soldiers who guarded his door. In theory, and often enough in fact, the entire ruling class of the empire was his personal household, his to raise up, his to send out, his to call back and undo. He was the head of a family so vast that it swallowed the state whole, so that to serve the empire and to belong to one man were, at the very top, the same single thing. Now, let your thoughts go back gently to the law that sat coiled at the base of that summit like a sleeping thing. It did not appear from nowhere. It was written down, deliberately, by one particular man, Mehmed, the second of that name, the one who in the year 1453 rode through the broken walls of Constantinople and made that ancient city his own. This same conqueror, in the code of law that bore his name, the Canon name, set down words that later readers have never quite been able to forget. That whichever of his sons should receive the throne, it was fitting that he put his brothers to death. For the good order of the world. For the good order of the world. Not out of hatred. Not in rage. In cold, deliberate care for the peace of the realm, so that no living rival brother could raise an army and tear the empire in two while the crops rotted and the frontier bled. A law of murder, written in the language of order and mercy toward everyone else. And so we come once more to that grey morning we touched upon before, but let us look at it now not as a fact, but as a picture. And then let it soften, and fade. The year is 1595. A new sultan has just come to the throne, and the law, patient and cold, must be obeyed. 19 of his brothers, 19, some of them grown, some of them children, some of them so young they had barely learnt to walk the palace corridors, each one, quietly, with a cord of silk drawn tight by careful hands, so that no royal blood should be spilled upon the ground. And then the small coffins, carried out one after another into the streets of the great city, past the shopkeepers and the water sellers and the ordinary people going about their ordinary mourning, a slow procession of the dynasty's own children, borne away so that one man could rule in peace. Let that image rest for only a moment. Feel the terrible weight of it, and then let it grow soft at the edges, the way a hard thing does when you are very tired and the room is very dark, until it is only a distant grey shape, far below you, no longer able to reach you here. Because the empire itself, in time, could not bear it either. Somewhere around the year 1603, the cord was, for the most part, laid down, and in its place came a gentler cruelty, if such a thing can be. The brothers were no longer killed, they were kept, shut away in guarded apartments deep within the palace, in rooms that came to be called, plainly, the cage. There they lived, not for a night, not for a season, but sometimes for decades, years upon years, within the same few chambers, hearing the muffled life of the palace beyond the walls, tended by servants, given every comfort the household could offer, and denied the one thing a prince most needed, the world itself. A man might enter the cage as a young boy and step out of it, blinking, an aging man summoned at last to rule an empire he had never once seen, having never ridden freely, never governed a village, never made a decision that mattered. Is it any wonder that some of them ruled unsteadily, that the hand upon the reins sometimes trembled? They had been kept alive and kept from living, both at once, in the same soft prison. And around all of this moved the silence, for the inner palace was a place built to hold quiet the way a cup holds water. Deep within it served a corps of men who could neither hear nor speak, the Dilses, the tongueless ones, chosen precisely because a secret could pass before them and go no further. They spoke among themselves in a language of the hands alone, a slow signing that flickered in the dim rooms, gestures instead of words, so that the business of the throne could be conducted in a hush unbroken by any voice. And these same silent men, whose hands could say so much and whose mouths could betray nothing, were sometimes the ones sent, in the end, to the fallen and the condemned, carrying with them a length of bowstring, and a stillness that no plea could reach. The quiet that protected the Sultan's secrets was the same quiet that carried out his sentences. This was the summit, then, the House of Osman, this one long unbroken line that had climbed out of a small frontier chieftaincy around the year 1299 and would not let go of the throne until the 1900s. 6 centuries of fathers and sons at the top of the house we are exploring. And this was the shape of life, at the very peak of it, to be the shadow of God, the guardian of the holy cities, the owner of an entire ruling class, and to be, for exactly those reasons, the loneliest and most closely watched man alive, with the cord and the cage and the tongueless men all folded quietly into the price of the crown. So rest here a breath longer, on this highest floor, where the air is thin and gilded and very still. Now step down from that highest floor. Step down a single rung and find, waiting there, a man who in many ways ran the empire better than the Sultan himself, who held in his hands more daily executive power than any other living person, who commanded armies, signed treaties, issued orders that moved hundreds of thousands of lives, and who wore around his neck, on a cord, a small physical object that could be taken from him at any moment, without warning and without appeal, and whose loss would mean not merely the end of his career, but quite possibly the end of his life. This was the Sadrazam, the Grand Vizier, the man at the top of the ladder who was not the Sultan, which meant he was simultaneously the empire's most powerful servant and, of all the high officials in that enormous machine, the one who lived closest to the possibility of sudden and public destruction. The object on the cord was the Meshra-i-Humayun, the imperial seal, the Sultan's own seal, pressed into wax to make official the orders and appointments and decrees that governed an empire stretching from the Balkans to Mesopotamia, from the Black Sea to the Nile. The Sultan gave it to the man he chose as Grand Vizier, and from that moment the Vizier wore it against his chest like a second heartbeat. To hold the seal was to hold the state. To lose it was to lose everything. When a sultan wished to dismiss a Grand Vizier, or worse, he simply sent word that the seal should be returned. There was no hearing, no council, no petition. A man who had commanded the armies of the greatest power in the known world walked back to the palace, removed the cord from his neck, placed it in a silk cloth, and handed it across. What happened after that depended entirely on how much the Sultan wished to go further. And the Sultan could always wish to go further. So imagine what it was to occupy that office, to sit each morning at the head of the Divan Humayun, the Imperial Council, in the second court of Topkap, surrounded by pashas and ministers and the empire's chief judges and treasurers, and to be the one man whose word carried the weight of the Sultan's own. The Divan met 4 days a week, and through its sessions moved the life of the state, appointments to provincial governorships, rulings on legal disputes that had travelled up from distant judges, decisions about campaigns and expenditures, and the conduct of officials who had run afoul of the law or of a powerful enemy. The vizier presided over it all, listened to arguments, issued judgments, and set the tone of governance, and did this while knowing that the window overlooking the council chamber contained, behind a grille, the Sultan himself, sometimes watching in silence, so that the man nominally in charge could never quite forget that the man behind the screen was always there and always the final word. In later centuries, as the sultans receded further into the inner palace and became more ceremonial and more insulated, the Grand Vizier's authority grew even more absolute in practical terms. From the 17th century onward, he governed increasingly from his own compound, the Bab-Li, which Europeans called the Sublime Porte, and it is from this building, not from the palace, that European diplomats conducted most of their Ottoman business, because the Porte was where decisions were actually made. When ambassadors wrote back to their courts describing Ottoman policy, they wrote about what the Porte had said, what the Porte had decided, what the Porte would or would not accept in negotiations. The Porte was so completely the functional seat of government that Western languages adopted it as a synonym for the Ottoman state itself. You could address a letter to the Sublime Porte, and everyone understood you meant the Ottoman government. The same way you might address a letter to the Court of St. James and mean England. And yet for all this power, The seal, the council, the compound that stood for an entire civilization in the correspondence of kings. The office came furnished with a condition that a Western mind, trained to think of power as something that protects you, finds genuinely startling. Many grand viziers were executed by the sultan they served, not disgraced, not exiled to a comfortable estate with a pension and a reduced title, executed, often with startling speed, sometimes on the basis of a lost campaign or a court intrigue, or simply a sultan's changed mood. The office had a brutal turnover in the crisis decades of the 17th century especially, when viziers came and went so rapidly that some held the seal for months before it was taken back under circumstances fatal to its former wearer. The most picturable sign of how power worked at this level was a practice at the palace's outermost gate, the Bab Mayun, the imperial gate, where anyone entering the palace's first court could pass beneath it and on certain mornings find that something had been left there to be read by all who came and went. The severed head, or sometimes the preserved body, of a dismissed and executed high official could be displayed at this gate, a public declaration posted at the threshold of power itself, of what the Sultan had decided. Sometimes the crime was noted alongside. The logic was the legibility that ran through the whole empire, just as rank was written in cloth and turban and the colour of your boots. Disgrace and execution were written in stone and flesh at the gate. The state needed you to be able to read it at a glance. A displayed head was a sentence written in the only script that no one could misread. And still men sought the office, competed for it, manoeuvred through decades of court life to approach it. Because this was also the logic of the system, the risk and the prize were inseparable, and for the men produced by the machine there was no alternative framework. The empire was the world, the sultan was the summit, and to rise within it was the only direction that existed. Among the most extraordinary illustrations of what the machine could produce, and of the paradox that slaves with no lineage often governed better than sultans with every advantage of birth, is the story of a family from Albania who arrived in the Sultan's service as the product of exactly that system, and who, in the middle years of the 17th century, when the empire was fraying at the edges from military reversal and financial strain, and a succession of sultans too, young or too erratic to govern effectively, essentially stepped in and held the structure together with their own hands. Kaprul Mehmed Pasha had come up through the household in the way the machine intended, of Albanian origin, educated in the Ottoman system, working his way through the kitchen hierarchy of the palace, for the palace kitchens were themselves a training ground, a hierarchy of their own, and men of talent emerged from them into broader administrative roles. By the time Sultan Mehmed IV appointed him Grand Vizier in 1656, he was old, past 80 by some accounts, and he is said to have accepted the appointment only on the condition that the Sultan would not interfere with his decisions. The condition was granted. What followed, under Kaprul Mehmed and then his son, and then other members of the same family, was a generation or more of competent, centralizing, sometimes brutal but functionally effective administration that reversed the military and fiscal slide, reconsolidated authority, and extended Ottoman rule. A family of Albanian origin, former kitchen servants and diverm products, legally slaves, governed one of the greatest empires on earth across several decades, and governed it better, by most measures, than the imperial dynasty they served. This is not a footnote. This is the system working exactly as designed, the men with no independent power base, no inherited land, no family network outside the Sultan's own household, turned out to be the most reliable governors. The man who owned nothing except what the Sultan gave him had every reason to work tirelessly to keep the Sultan's empire running, because the Sultan's empire was the only world he had. Rest here a moment, on this second rung, which is dizzying in its own right. Then let the narration do what it must, and follow the chain down to where all of these men began. To the place where the raw material entered the machine, to the moment before the seal and the council and the bowstring, when the whole process was just a small boy standing in a Balkan village, while a stranger wrote his name in a register. The Deverm. The word means collecting, or gathering, the way you gather a harvest, and the harvest, in this case, was children. It was a periodic levy. Not annual, not constant, but ordered when the state required it. A decree would go out, and officials would travel to the villages of the empire's Christian populations in the Balkans, to Greek villages, Serbian villages, Albanian ones, Bulgarian, Bosnian, carrying with them the authority of the Sultan and a blank register, and they would begin the work of selection. The boys they were looking for fell roughly between the ages of 8 and 18, though accounts vary on the precision of this, and the selection was deliberate. They were looking for health, for intelligence, for physical proportion, for something in the face or the bearing that suggested a boy would be worth the investment of training. 1 boy per household was the standard. You were not stripping a family of all its sons, and there were exemptions. An only son was generally to be left, a married youth, boys of certain occupations or communities. And before the levy moved on from a village, every boy taken was recorded, his name, his village, his physical description noted down in the register so that he could be identified, tracked, and not substituted or smuggled back. This last detail is worth holding. The physical description in the register meant that the boy was now, in an administrative sense, a permanent record. He had been seen by the state, named by the state, measured by the state. He belonged to the state, and the register ensured that neither he nor his family could pretend otherwise. The families knew what was happening. The boys knew, in the way that children understand the large things that are done to them without their consent, through their parents' faces, through the silence of the walk to the official, through the register man's quill moving down the page. The children were going away. They would not come back, not in any ordinary sense. They would be converted from Christianity to Islam and would be renamed and would be set on a path that led either to a soldier's barracks or to a palace school, but in either case to a world entirely unlike the one they had been born into. We should say plainly what this was, a coercive taking of children from their parents, conducted as a matter of state policy. There is no version of it that was not, at its core, an act of uprooting, and the grief in those villages when the levy came was real. Parents lost their children. Children lost their parents. A whole world of language and faith and family was severed in an afternoon. And yet, and this is the structural twist the dossier insists on, the one that makes the Deverm genuinely strange and not merely brutal, this levy was also, for some boys, an escalator to wealth, education and power that their village could never have provided. The empire at its height was genuinely investing in these children. Not as a kindness, but as a rational policy, the state needed talented administrators and soldiers. It needed them to be absolutely loyal, and it had discovered that loyalty was most reliably produced not by rewarding free men with titles and land that they might then leverage to build independent power, but by taking boys who had nothing, giving them everything, and making the gift conditional on complete dependence. The boys who arrived at the palace or the barracks with no family, no property, no language except what was given to them, no faith except what was instilled in them, these boys had only the empire. So they served it with the focus of people who understand that what was given can always be taken back. The selection process divided them almost immediately into two streams. The brightest, the most promising, the ones whose combination of intelligence and bearing marked them as future governors rather than soldiers, were separated from the rest and sent to the palace itself, to the Enderun, the inner school at the heart of Topkap, where they would be educated for years in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, in religious and secular law, in music and poetry and the protocols of the court, in horsemanship and archery, in the precise ceremonies of imperial service. These boys would grow up inside the palace walls, close to the Sultan, trained by proximity and curriculum to become, eventually, the viziers and governors and commanders who ran the state. The Enderun was, in the language of our own time, the most exclusive and most consequential school in the world, and admission was involuntary. The others, the majority, went first not to the palace but outward, away from Istanbul, to Turkish farming families in Anatolia. This is a detail that surprises people. The Devrim boys did not go directly from their Balkan villages to the barracks. They spent time first in the countryside of Anatolia, learning to speak Turkish, absorbing the rhythms of rural Islamic life, performing agricultural labor, becoming, over the course of some years, something other than what they had been. The transformation was deliberate. By the time they moved on to the Asimi Olan Corps, the novices, the cadets, the word Asimi meaning raw or inexperienced, and Olan simply meaning boys, they had already passed through the first stage of becoming someone new. The Anatolian farming family was the forge in which the original boy was softened and reshaped. The core was where the new soldier was made. The Asimi Olan were the training pool feeding the Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry, and we will follow them down into that world shortly. But here, at the intake rung, there is one more fact to linger on, because it inverts the tragedy we might assume is the only story. In some regions of the Balkans, particularly along the border zones where the empire had governed longest, where its rewards were most visible, Muslim families were documented attempting to include their sons in the Devrim through bribery, paying officials to add a Muslim boy to the register under a false Christian identity. This was against the rules. The Devrim was a Christian levy, and Muslim boys were by law excluded from it. But the bribery happened because some families could see clearly what the Devrim was from the outside. It was one of the few paths in the empire that could take a boy from a provincial village to a governorship, a generalship, a position at the center of the world's most powerful state. The theoretical route through inherited wealth and social connection was slower, less certain, and less likely to end near the throne. The Devrim, coercive as it was also a golden escalator, and there were parents who could see it and wanted it for their sons badly enough to pay. Hold both of these things at once: the grief at the selection and the bribery to be selected, the weeping and the bribing. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. The empire was large enough and strange enough to contain them both in the same institution, on the same day in different villages, and the tension between them is precisely what the Devrim was. An act of mass coercion that also functioned as a genuine meritocracy for those who passed through it, and that most other empires of the time could not offer. This was the machine's intake. Now it needs a name for what the machine produced. The word is kul. Kul means slave or bondsman or servant, a word that carried multiple registers in Ottoman Turkish, from the servitude of the lowest labourer to the willing devotion of the mystic before God. In its imperial usage, kul meant the Sultan's own slave, his personal property, a person whose existence was in every formal and legal sense an extension of the Sultan's will. Every man who entered the Sultan's service through the divan, every soldier in the household troops, every governor of a province who had risen through the palace school, each of them was, in the law and in the formal language of the court, the kul of the Padia, his slave. And these same men could own property. They could marry and have children. They could accumulate wealth, build houses, endow charities, conduct businesses. They commanded armies of tens of thousands. They governed territories larger than most European kingdoms. They negotiated with foreign powers and made decisions that determined the fates of millions. A kul serving as a provincial governor had more practical authority over the people in his care than most European noblemen of equivalent territory. And those European noblemen owned their land, answered to their own law, and could pass everything on to their sons. The kul could be executed by the Sultan's order without trial, without appeal, without ceremony, at any moment, for any reason, or no stated reason. Everything he had accumulated was technically the Sultan's property returning to the Sultan's possession. His sons did not inherit his office. His power died with the Sultan's will to grant it. Kapkulu was the collective term, slaves of the porte, slaves of the gate, the entire standing salaried household force that made up the empire's central military and administrative corps, as distinct from the provincial cavalry who were free men holding land grants. The Kapkulu were paid from the treasury. The Sipahi cavalry were paid from the land. This distinction between salaried slave soldiers at the centre and free cavalry living off their grants in the provinces is the empire's main structural seam, and almost everything that follows in the life of a man depends on which side of that seam he was born or placed on. But at this rung, the rung of the kul, the kapkulu, the structural definition of the slave elite. What we need to understand is the load-bearing logic beneath all the apparent contradiction. Why would a state run by slaves run better than one run by free men? Why would a sultan trust a kul with an army and not trust a free nobleman? The answer is not complicated once you see it, and once seen it cannot be unseen. A free nobleman in almost any pre-modern state was a man with roots. He had land that he owned, land his father owned before him, land he intended his son to inherit. He had a network of alliances, cousins and clients and creditors and debtors, people whose interests were tangled with his in ways that did not begin with the king and would not end with the king's pleasure. He had an identity that existed independent of the crown. When the crown asked him to do something he disliked, he had resources, literal, legal, social, with which to push back, to delay, to build a faction, to wait the king out and see if circumstances changed. A landed noble could survive the loss of royal favour because his land remained, and his tenants remained, and his family name remained. He had somewhere to stand that was not in the shadow of the throne. The kul had none of this. He had arrived in Istanbul speaking no Turkish, with nothing and knowing no one. Everything he had, language, faith, education, rank, salary, quarters, influence, had been given to him by the Sultan's household and could be removed by it. He had no independent land, no network of blood relations positioned anywhere in the empire's hierarchy, no identity that predated the sultan's service. His entire existence was structured by and for the state. He could not simply retreat to a family estate if he fell from favor, because there was no estate. He could not call upon cousins for support, because the system had been designed to sever him from the world of cousins. He was structurally alone in the universe, except for the sultan who owned him, the cause that had raised him, and the institution that gave his life its shape. Which is precisely why he could be trusted. Not because he was more virtuous, not because he was naturally more loyal, not because he had taken an oath and meant it more sincerely than a free man might. He could be trusted because he had no alternative. To betray the Sultan was to cut the only rope that connected him to everything. There was nothing waiting below. He was loyal because the machine had been engineered to make loyalty indistinguishable from self-preservation. And because he had no land, no lineage, no independent power base, the Sultan could give him anything without fear. Give a free nobleman an army, and you have armed a man who has something to defend besides the Sultan's throne. Give a Kul an army, and you have armed a man whose only world is the Sultan's world. The sword points outward, because there is nothing else for it to point toward. This is the load-bearing paradox of the Ottoman system, the one this whole slow tour has been building toward. Elevation and ownership were not opposites. They were the same thing. The higher a man climbed in the Kapkulu, the more completely he belonged to the Sultan. And the more completely he belonged to the Sultan, the higher he could be trusted to climb. Power was not something you earned by acquiring independence. Power was something you were granted in proportion to your dependence. The system ran on inverted logic, inverted by the standards of almost every other empire or court in the world at the time, and it ran well when it ran, because the inversion was not an accident, but a design. Consider the Grand Vizier again, from this vantage. He held the seal, he governed the state, he presided over the council, commanded campaigns, set the fiscal policy of an empire, and he wore the Sultan's property around his neck, and could be executed on an afternoon's notice, and knew this every morning when he woke, and every evening when he lay down. The power and the ownership were the same cord. The seal was on one end of it, and the bowstring was on the other, and the vizier spent his tenure walking the length between them. Now comes the question the structure of this tour is arranged to answer, and which the following rungs will pay off in full, if the Kul was the engine, and the slave elite was the machine's ruling class. Then what was the life of the men inside this machinery? What did they wear? What were they paid? What did they eat? And what did the shape of their days actually feel like, rung by rung, from the soldiers' barracks to the palace school, to the provincial manor, to the harem's inner world? The answer begins in a kitchen. Not metaphorically. Literally, in a kitchen, with the smell of bread and the sound of a copper kettle, because the empire's most feared soldiers organized their entire identity around the act of cooking and eating together, and wore the symbols of the kitchen on their heads, and called their officers by the names of kitchen workers, and in doing so built one of the most distinctive institutional cultures in the history of warfare. But that story belongs to the next rung. Stay here a little longer, on this one. The Kul who had made it through the system, the Deverm boy who survived the Anatolian farm and the cadet corps, or who came out of the palace school into administrative service, lived in a world where the language of ownership was simply the language of belonging, and where belonging was the only security that existed. He belonged to the Sultan the way a man belongs to a house he was built inside and cannot leave. The house defined him, and in turn he held up one of its walls. The strange gift the system offered, in exchange for that total ownership, was total membership. You had no family, but you had the course. You had no lineage, but you had the okak, the hearth, the institutional fire that had been burning since before your birth and would continue burning after your death, and while you lived inside its warmth, you were fed and paid and ranked and known. The Ottoman system could take everything from a boy and give him in return an identity more durable than the one it had taken. Whether this was a fair exchange is a question the machine was not designed to ask. The empire was built out of people who had been given no choice about the building of it, and it lasted 6 centuries, and at its height it was the most powerful political entity in the world between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. These facts coexist. The machine ran on coercion, and the machine ran magnificently. Both things, all of it true, at the same time, in the same empire, in the same lifetime. And now the narration begins its slow descent further down the ladder, past the vizier with his seal, and the Devurm boy with his blank register, and the cull with his clean, total dependence, down toward the barracks, the kitchen fire, the bread ration, and the overturned cauldron that could, on a given afternoon in a given century, topple the most powerful sultan in the world. The janissaries are waiting, the okak is lit, the soup is on. The yenieri, the new soldier, though by the time you encountered one he was anything but new, the corps having existed for well over a century before most of its members were born, stood apart from everything else the empire had produced, not because of the fighting exactly, though the fighting was real and documented and earned. Apart because of what the janissary was, structurally, in a world still organized around inherited land and inherited name. He was a salaried professional, uniformed, fed from a common kitchen, paid quarterly in silver coin, regardless of whether a campaign had been won or lost that year. In an age when most armies in the world were assembled from feudal obligation and desperate poverty, and then dispersed the moment the battle ended, the janissary lived in a barracks, ate from a common pot, and drew a wage. This was not ordinary. This was, in many parts of Europe, something that did not exist yet. The word uluf named the salary, the quarterly payment in AK, the small silver coins that were the Ottoman economy's bloodstream. 4 times a year, the corps assembled in an order prescribed by rank and tradition, and the coins were distributed. A janissary at the lower end of the corps received enough to live on, modestly. A senior man with years of service behind him received considerably more. The state kept meticulous records of who was owed what. You had a name in a register. You had a fixed entitlement. In a world where most men's income was a harvest and a prayer, the quarterly uluf was a kind of certainty, the empire's promise written in silver, renewed 4 times a year. And then there was the bread. The daily bread ration was not a luxury. It was the foundation. It arrived from the regimental kitchen, which was itself the centre of everything, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a physical, structural, institutional sense. The kitchen was where the corps ate, but it was also where the corps existed in the truest way. Each order, each regiment or company within the larger janissary corps had its kitchen, and the symbol of that kitchen was the kazan, the great copper cauldron, heavy enough to require several men to move, polished and maintained with the care you might give a regimental flag. Because the kazan was the flag, it was the living emblem of the corps' identity. as tangible as metal and as old as the institution's memory. Think of what this meant in daily life. You were a cull, you had no family, you had no inherited land, you had, in the legal sense, no lineage. What you had instead was the okak. The word means hearth, fire, the domestic centre around which a household arranges itself. The Janissaries called their core the okak deliberately. The hearth was not poetic. The hearth was where you ate and slept, and were warm when it was cold, and known when you might otherwise be nothing. You did not grow up in a house with parents. You grew up inside the institution, and the institution fed you, and the feeding was the bond. The ranks inside the corps were named accordingly. The Orbak, literally the soup man, was what you might translate in a Western military frame as a colonel, the commander of an order. He was the soup man, the man who stood between his soldiers and the cauldron, who answered for whether the pot was full, who represented the regiment in formal processions and bore its honours in ceremony. His title was the kitchen's title. Another rank, the Karakuluku, carried a name rooted in the kitchen's service, the scullion, the one who tends the fire and the pot from below. Higher and lower and all around, the language of military command in the most feared infantry corps in the world at its height was the language of cooking and feeding. The burk was what you wore on your head, a distinctive felt hat. White, with a hanging sleeve like flap down the back, and in it, worn like a badge or an ornament, a spoon. The spoon was not practical. Nobody needed a spoon tucked into a felt hat. The spoon was a statement. It said, "I am of the corps. I eat from the cauldron. My allegiance is to the okak, to this kitchen, to this hearth, and to the sultan whose bread built this fire." The spoon was the Janissary's coat of arms, and he wore it on his forehead. You can dwell on this detail for a moment, because it is stranger and more deliberate than it first appears. The most powerful standing army in the Mediterranean world, the infantry that had broken Byzantine Constantinople's walls, that would march into Hungary and Egypt and across North Africa, chose food as its symbol, specifically chose the kitchen over the sword and the shield. The reason, if you follow the machine's logic, is that the kitchen was the point. The food was the relationship. The Sultan fed you, literally, from his kitchens, and your loyalty was the price of the bread, not abstract loyalty in some philosophical sense, but material, daily loyalty that arrived in your bowl and renewed itself every morning. You ate, and you belonged. The two things were the same thing. This is why, when the relationship broke down, it broke down through the food. The signal of Janissary revolt, across 2 centuries of Janissary revolts, from the early empires through to the late ones, was not the drawing of swords, not a manifesto, not a proclamation. The signal was the overturned cauldron. When the soldiers of a regiment refused the Sultan's food, when they took the great copper kazan and tipped it onto the parade ground, the pilaf spilling across the stones, the steam dying in the air, everyone who saw it knew exactly what it meant. The meal was rejected, the bond was broken. The Sultan's bread was refused, and the refusal was as public and unmistakable as a declaration of war, because in the language this institution had built for itself over generations, eating was loyalty, and refusing to eat was revolt. Grand viziers lost their offices, and sometimes their heads, when the cauldrons tipped. Sultans who could not placate the core in time found the Janissaries marching toward the palace rather than away from it. This is not a small thing. The most powerful institution of coercion in the empire was itself the primary check on sultanic power in practice. The Sultan could, legally, execute any of them. In practice, when the cauldrons went over, the Sultan negotiated. The mechanism the empire had built to make it invincible in the field had also built, by accident of design, a permanent Praetorian pressure at the heart of the state. To understand how this happened, you need to follow the arc from the beginning. At the outset, the Janissary corps was staffed by Diverm recruits, Christian boys collected, converted, trained, and enrolled as cull. They were forbidden to marry while in active service. They could not practice a trade on the side. They could not hold heritable property. They were the cause and nothing else, and this totalness was exactly the point. A soldier with a wife and children and a shop and property has things he values more than the corps, things that might compete with his loyalty to the institution. The Janissary, as originally designed, had nothing to compete with the Okak. He was all soldier, all the time, because there was nothing else for him to be. But institutions drift. Marriage bans softened and eventually lapsed. Janissaries began to take wives. The sons of Janissaries, who saw the advantages of the corps, the steady salary, the quarterly coin, the bread, the status, wanted in, and the institution, which had no strong mechanism against it, began to absorb them. Membership became heritable in practice, then semi-officially. A man whose father was on the rolls could expect to be placed on the rolls. The corps began to recruit from within its own families rather than from the Diverm. The slave soldier, who had no family, gradually became a soldier whose family was the foundation of his membership, which inverted the entire logic of the institution. Alongside this came the second drift, the trade. Janissaries had time between campaigns, and time between campaigns with a salary coming in and a family to support is time that turns toward commerce. They opened shops. They became artisans, merchants, moneylenders, landlords, the empire, which needed the ache and the political stability that came from not constantly confronting the cause, mostly looked away. By the 17th century and into the 18th, there were men on the Janissary rolls who had never been to a campaign in their lives, men who drew the quarterly uluf as a sinecure, a pension essentially, while they ran their businesses and raised their families in the city. The number of men on the rolls swelled past what the actual military need could justify, because membership was valuable for reasons that had nothing to do with warfare. The corps that had once been the Sultan's most loyal, most dependent instrument had become something closer to a hereditary guild with military titles and political muscle. When sultans tried to reform the army, to adopt new formations, new European-style training, new technologies, the Janissaries resisted. Not out of pure conservatism, though that was part of it, but out of rational interest. The old system was the system that paid them and gave them status, and the new system threatened to make them irrelevant. Every reform effort met the overturned cauldron or the threat of it. The end, when it came, was swift and violent. Mahmud II had been watching, planning, and waiting for the right moment for years. He had quietly cultivated a new military force, trained in European methods, built in parallel to the existing institution, so that when the confrontation came, he would not be without soldiers. In 1826, he moved. When the Janissaries, predictably, overturned their cauldrons in protest at the new order, Mahmud II did something no sultan had managed to do cleanly in 2 centuries. He fired back. The artillery opened on the Janissary barracks in Istanbul. The barracks burned. The surviving Janissaries were executed, expelled, or dispersed. The corpse's symbols were destroyed. Its records were suppressed. Even its name was erased from official use. Ottoman sources called this the Vaka-i Hayri, the auspicious incident. Not a massacre, not a crisis, an auspicious event, a fortunate occasion, the happy moment when a thing that had outlived its purpose was removed so the empire could begin again. The language was deliberate and controlled and told you exactly how the state wanted it remembered, not as a defeat for the Sultan, but as a liberation, a tidying up, the removal of an obstacle to progress. Whether the men in the burning barracks experienced it as auspicious is a different question, and the machine was not designed to ask it. From the first Diverm levy to the smoke above the barracks in 1826, the Yenieri had been the empire's heartbeat, its most feared weapon, its most dangerous internal threat, its most visible institutional paradox, and its most spectacular institutional failure. The slave soldier who was supposed to have nothing became an entire hereditary class with everything to protect. The corp that ran on loyalty to the Sultan ended by dictating to sultans. The cauldron that was supposed to feed loyalty eventually fed revolt, and when revolt was finally met with cannon, the fire the okak had kept burning for centuries went out. The bread ration was done, the soup was cold. Now follow the road out of the barracks, out of the capital, along the stone tracks that led into the provinces, into Anatolia, into the Balkans, into the Arab lands and beyond, and find the other figure who carried the empire on his back in the classical period. The one who lived not in a barracks but on a piece of land, and whose relationship to that land was one of the most particular and carefully designed relationships in the whole system. The Timal Sipahi was a cavalryman. He was, unlike the Janissary, almost always freeborn, typically Muslim, though conversion could complicate that generalization, and he served not as a salaried professional, but through a specific grant that the state made to him, and that he was expected to translate directly into mounted military service. His grant was called a timar, and what that word meant precisely is the key to understanding how the Ottoman Empire fielded an army for 2 centuries at almost no direct cash cost to the central treasury. A timar was not a piece of land. This is the first and most important clarification, the one that separates the Ottoman system from the Western feudalism it superficially resembles. The Timal Sipahi did not own his land. He could not sell it. He could not pass it to his children as a matter of right. The land itself remained, in Ottoman legal doctrine, Miri, state land, the Sultan's domain, and the Sipahi held only the right to collect specified revenues from it, a fixed share of the harvest from the peasants who farmed it, dues on marriages and sales and certain livestock, the income from designated transactions within the district. The timar was a revenue assignment, a tax handle granted to a soldier in exchange for his sword. The thresholds were defined clearly, and they defined your rank within the Sipahi class as legibly as the size of your turban defined your rank in the palace. A basic timar ran from roughly 3,000 ek of annual revenue to 20,000. This was the smallest, most modest grant, enough for a man to arm himself, feed his horse, and meet the campaign each year. A zemet stretched from 20,000 ek to 100,000, a larger holding, enough to maintain several retainers and ride to war in considerably more comfort. And above both of these sat the haz, the great revenue assignment beginning at 100,000 ek, reserved for the empire's most senior officials, the viziers and governors, and the highest military commanders. And, at the summit, the Sultan himself, whose haz was the entire productive output of the empire. The genius of the Timar system, from the state's perspective, was the sebel. For every roughly 3,000 ek of Timar revenue above a defined baseline, the Sipahi was required to furnish one additional armed and mounted retainer, a sebel, fully equipped and ready for campaign. Larger grant, more sebel. If your Timar yielded 9,000 eke, you rode to the Sultan's campaign with 2 sebel behind you. If it yielded 18,000, you brought 5. You did not pay these men from a salary the state advanced to you. You paid them from the revenues of the land, which the land's peasants had already provided. The state had, in one elegant mechanism, outsourced both the cost and the logistics of a provincial cavalry to the province itself. The grain fed the peasant who paid the tithe that armed the Sipahi, who brought the sebel, who fought the Sultan's campaign. The cycle was self-sustaining and largely self-administering. Imagine what this meant for your daily life as a Timar Sipahi in the classical period, say the late 15th or mid-16th century, when the system was functioning as its designers intended. You lived in or near the villages whose revenues supported you. You were not an absentee landlord hiding in a city. The system required your presence. Because your presence was partly what you owed the peasants in exchange for your share of their production. You were the local authority, you ensured order, you mediated disputes at a certain basic level. You were the visible face of the empire in the places where most people lived, which were not the capitals, but the fields and the orchards and the market towns. Each autumn, after the harvest was in, you rode through your district and collected what was owed, a fixed proportion of the grain, typically paid in kind, and then sold. Dues on marriages within the village, a small payment that the Timuriate collected when a family gave a daughter in marriage. Fines for certain infractions, the share from whatever mills or presses operated on the land. You knew the names of the families. You knew which fields had yielded well and which had failed. The relationship was close and daily in a way that abstract taxation could never be, which was both its virtue and its danger, because closeness also meant the temptation to squeeze, to take more than the Kanun allowed, to use proximity as leverage. The state was aware of this temptation, which is why the Kanuname, the body of sultanic law, was so specific about what a Sipahi could collect and how. Inspectors travelled periodically through the provinces to check the registers, hear complaints from the Riaya, and report back on abuses. The system was not perfect, and the gap between what the law allowed and what actually happened in a remote village was real and sometimes wide. But the framework existed, and it existed precisely because the state understood that a Sipahi who exploited his riaya too badly would eventually have no riaya left to tax, and a depleted province made a depleted army, which made a weaker sultan. And so the circle of justice, even as an aspiration, shaped the practical limits of how far extraction could go before the centre intervened. What you did not have as a Timar Sipahi was security of tenure in the way a Western feudal lord might understand it. Your Timar was conditional. You were expected at every campaign the Sultan called. Miss the muster without an accepted excuse, illness, documented local emergency, a conflict the governor could verify, and your grant could be revoked. Fail to bring the appropriate number of sebel fully equipped, and your grant could be reduced. The threat was not theoretical. The state's registers tracked who had appeared at the campaign and who had not, and the redistribution of Timars from men who had failed in their obligations was one of the empire's regular administrative rhythms. There was no primogeniture, no automatic right of a son to inherit what his father had held. The son could petition, could be recommended, could be granted the father's timar if he himself could fulfill the military obligation, but this was a grant renewed, not a right inherited, which is a crucial distinction the system maintained carefully, at least in its first 2 centuries. This conditionality was the mechanism of central control. The Timar cavalry was obedient not because it was made of slaves, these were free men, but because it was made of men who held everything they had on a tenure that depended on the Sultan's continued favour and their own continued service. Different mechanism, same result. Dependence bred loyalty, and loyalty was the engine the empire ran on. The horse under you, the weapons you maintained, the armour your Sebel wore. All of this was purchased from the revenues of the land, maintained from the same source, replenished when worn out from the same fund. You were, in a sense, a small military enterprise, revenues in, military capacity out, the whole calculation performed at the provincial level so that the central state could concentrate its cash on other things. On the fleet, on the palace, on the Janissary Uluf, which the treasury did have to pay in coin. The Timar cavalry was, in the most literal sense, self-funded. But the land did not stay constant. Populations shifted, revenues declined in bad years, villages were abandoned in times of plague or conflict. And the technology of war was changing, not slowly, the way agricultural practices changed, but in the compressed arc of a century and a half, with firearms spreading across the region and transforming what a battlefield required. The mounted cavalryman, with his spear and composite bow and his half-dozen armoured retainers, had been decisive in the 15th century and useful in the 16th. By the late 16th century and into the 17th, the battlefield was increasingly shaped by mass infantry armed with firearms, trained and drilled and paid in coin. The Janissaries were that infantry, and they were increasingly expensive, increasingly numerous, increasingly paid in ache the treasury had to actually produce. The Timar cavalry was not obsolete overnight, and the transition was messier and longer than a clean narrative would suggest. But the direction was clear. What the empire needed, after a certain point, was money. Cash, silver, the grain that flowed from village to Sipahi to campaign was not the resource the state most urgently required anymore. What it needed was the kind of liquid wealth that could pay gunsmiths and gunpowder makers and musketeers and artillery crews. And the Timar system, brilliant as it was for the conditions it was designed for, was not primarily a cash machine. It was a grain machine, a horse machine, a local order machine. So the state began to look at its provinces differently. Not as a network of cavalry producing land grants, but as a source of cash revenue that could be extracted quickly and sent to the centre as coin. The mechanism it reached for already existed in smaller forms, and would grow to reshape the entire economic and social landscape of the empire. The mechanism was called iltizam, and the man who operated it was the multezim, and the relationship between them and the villages below them was, in many ways, the Timar system turned inside out. Iltizam means, simply, tax farming. The state's right to collect taxes from a given district was auctioned to the highest bidder, not granted to a soldier in exchange for service, but sold to whoever would pay the most for the right to collect it. The Mlitisim paid an agreed sum to the treasury up front. This was the attractive part, from the treasury's perspective, cash. Now, guaranteed, without the state having to do the collecting itself. The treasury received its revenue immediately, in coin, without the delay and uncertainty of agricultural cycles and provincial management. What happened after the miltezim paid his sum was entirely his business. He sent his agents into the district. They collected whatever they could extract from the population. The taxes that were officially owed, certainly, but also, in practice, whatever more they could get. The multezim's profit was the difference between what he had paid for the right and what he managed to collect. The incentive was not to protect the peasant's productive capacity. The incentive was to maximize the extraction in whatever time the contract ran, which was typically a short term. A 1-year or 2-year tax farm gave the miltezim very little reason to invest in the district's long-term health, and every reason to press hard while the contract lasted. The riaya at the bottom of this arrangement experienced the difference as a material reality. More was taken, less was owed as justification, and the legal protections that the Timar-era Kanun name had provided were harder to invoke against a private contractor accountable to the treasury, not to the empire's ideals of governance. The state was not unaware of this problem. The tension between short-term cash extraction and long-term productive stability was one the empire's administrators recognized and wrote about, and the reform introduced in 1695, the Malayan, the life tenure tax farm, was an attempt to square the circle. Instead of selling a short-term contract, the state sold the right to collect a district's revenues for the lifetime of the buyer. The logic was that a man who held a district for his entire life would have at least some incentive to keep the underlying population viable, since a ruined district would produce nothing in his old age. The Malik buyer paid a large sum up front, plus annual installments, but held the grant for life. The long-term consequence was not quite what the reformers had intended. Life tenure tax farms, held for decades, began to function more like de facto ownership than like temporary revenue assignments. The men who held them built networks, cultivated local relationships, accumulated influence in ways that short-term contractors never could. Their families expected to inherit the arrangements, even when the law said otherwise. They became, in many regions, the dominant local figures, the ayan, the provincial notables, the men who mediated between the central state and the villages, and increasingly did so on their own terms. The state had solved its short-term cash problem and created, over the following century, a class of entrenched regional power brokers who would, by the early 19th century, be governing large parts of the empire in effective autonomy. The solution to one problem had generated the precondition for the next one. The machine adapted, and the adaptation had costs that took generations to fully appear. Running beneath all of this, accelerating the transition from the Timar to the tax farm, and fueling the soldiers' unrest that kept the cauldrons on the edge of tipping, was a problem with the coins themselves. The ache, that small, polished sliver of silver that was the Ottoman economy's basic unit, the coin that paid the Janissaries uluf and the Timuriats sebel and the tax farmers' agreed fee to the treasury, was only valuable as long as it carried enough silver to make it so. The state knew this and had maintained the coin's weight and fineness for long stretches of the empire's history. But when the treasury ran short, when campaigns ran long, when the army grew beyond what stable revenues could support, when the Janissary rolls swelled past what the state could honestly afford, the temptation was to mint more coins by reducing the amount of silver in each one. Debasement, the coins looked the same, or nearly the same, and there were more of them. But each coin bought less than it had the previous year. The timing of the heaviest debasements aligned with a global disruption. In the late 16th century, Spanish silver from the mines of the Americas flooded into the Mediterranean economy, driving up prices across the entire region. A phenomenon later historians would call the price revolution, the general rise in the cost of goods across Europe and the Mediterranean over the course of the 16th century, hit the Ottoman economy as it hit all others, and hit it while the state was also debasing its own currency. The compounding effect was that the silver coin lost value from both directions at once. From within, because each coin was lighter, and from without, because the general price of goods was rising. A janissary paid his quarterly uluf in coins that bought less bread than they had a generation before, was not a janissary inclined to accept the situation quietly. The ache's debasement was a slow disaster written in metal. The state did what states in this position almost always do. It printed more of the problem, deferred the reckoning, hoped the next campaign would bring plunder enough to cover the gap. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. The soldiers knew, in the practical way that men who rely on a salary know when the salary has been quietly cut, that something had changed. The bread that the cauldron provided was real and daily and not debased. The coin was an abstraction that dwindled. The combination of hereditary janissary membership, commerce on the side, political leverage at the centre, and a salary in depreciating silver was the exact cocktail that transformed the okak from a military asset into a political crisis. Slowly enough that no single moment defined the transformation, but clearly enough that, looking back, the arc from the first de Worm levy to the smoke above the 1826 barracks reads as a single unbroken story of a mechanism working correctly until it worked itself into ruin. The Timuriot on his horse in the provinces watched the ache lose its gleam at the same time his own position was being undercut. First by the primacy of firearms that favoured infantry over cavalry. Then by the creeping spread of tax farms that replaced his role in the revenue system with that of the mlitezim. His sebel became, over time, an expensive anachronism. Campaigns no longer needed 10,000 mounted sipahi in the way they once had. They needed muskets and cannon and the money to buy powder. The horse was still noble. The taimar was still a real institution. But the centre of gravity had shifted, and the Taimal Sipahi, who rode out to the campaign in the late 17th century, occupied a world already tilting away from everything that had made his position make sense. The transitions were not clean. They were decades-long, contested, regionally uneven. In some areas the Taimar persisted well into the 18th century, functioning more or less as it had been designed to function. In others, it had been effectively replaced by tax farming a generation earlier. The empire's provinces were not a single uniform administrative landscape. They were a patchwork of arrangements that had evolved at different speeds in response to different pressures. And the men who navigated this landscape had to be flexible in ways the system's original architecture had not anticipated. What the machine could not fully replace in any of its iterations was the basic relationship at the bottom, the peasant and the land. The riaya who farmed the fields and paid the dues and endured the collecting agents and rebuilt after the campaigns passed through. They were there before the Timar and during the Iltisam and after the Malikn, persistent and fundamental in the way that the earth itself is fundamental. Not because they were passive, but because the entire architecture above them rested on their continued production. No soldier's salary, no tax farmer's profit, no treasury's balance, no vizier's seal. No sultan's campaign existed without the grain that the villages grew and the silver that the villages ultimately provided. The whole magnificent edifice of ranked privilege and coded cloth and quarterly coin descended, at the bottom, to a village in the Balkans or Anatolia or the Arab lands, and a family that woke before dawn to tend the fields that fed the machine. The ladder went all the way down, and at every rung the material reality was specific and daily, and neither glorious nor contemptible, but simply true. The Janissary's spoon in his felt cap, the Sipahi's sebel riding behind him in ranked formation, the Mltezim's agent in the village square with his ledger and his calculation, the debased arche changing hands, the cauldron on the fire. The narration has further still to go, down into the harem's corridors, past the eunuch's guarded door, out through the millet quarter where the Sephardic merchants sorted their spices, and the Orthodox patriarch kept his records in Greek, and the empire collected its sizzi and called it protection. But for now, let the fire in the okak settle, let the coins cool in someone's palm. Let the horse in the stable shift its weight and breathe. The word haram comes from Arabic, harm, and it simply means forbidden or protected, which in the language of the Ottoman world amounts to the same thing. What is forbidden is what must be guarded. What must be guarded is what is precious. So the word that would carry over centuries such enormous weight of misunderstanding, such layers of foreign fascination and lurid invention, described at its core something almost quiet. The private household of the Sultan, the place where his family lived, where his children grew, where the women of his world woke each morning to a hierarchy just as layered and just as exacting as anything in the divan or the army encampment outside the walls. You should hold that word for a moment before moving through the door. Forbidden, protected, the harem was not a pleasure garden, not primarily, though pleasure was not absent from it. It was a school, a court, an institution that ran on its own internal order, with its own ranks and stipends and rules of precedence, and at its base were women who had arrived the same way the Janissaries had arrived, taken from elsewhere, purchased, converted, renamed, enrolled into the Sultan's household as his property, his slaves. Career. The word means concubine, or female slave, and like the word kul, the male slave of the Sultan, it carried within it the same strange Ottoman alchemy by which belonging to the Sultan was not the end of a life's possibilities, but sometimes the beginning of them. A Kariye entered the harem young. She would have been educated in Turkish, in the etiquette of the court, in music and needlework and the protocols of service, in the religious practice that had claimed her at conversion. She would have been given a stipend, small but real, paid in coin. She would have had her own rank within the harem's internal ladder, her own quarters whose size and location expressed precisely where she stood. And she would have understood, as she learned the landscape of those hundreds of rooms in Topkap's inner precincts, the warren of corridors and courtyards and apartments that made the harem a small city unto itself, that the ladder above her was real, and that some women climbed it. The first rung of visibility was simply to be noticed. The word for it was gızda, which means, with beautiful directness, in the eye. A woman who had caught the Sultan's attention was gızda, and the difference between that and invisibility was not merely romantic. It was material. Her allowance would increase, her quarters might improve, the other women around her would recalibrate. In a world where proximity to the Sultan was the only currency that ultimately mattered, being in his eye was already a kind of wealth. But Güzde was not the summit, not even close. The summit required something that no amount of charm or beauty alone could manufacture, a son. A Kariye who bore the Sultan, a living male child, became Haseki, a word that scholars translate roughly as favorite or chosen, but which meant, in practice, the mother of a potential heir, which meant, in the brutal arithmetic of Ottoman succession, a woman whose life and safety and power were now tied to that child's survival. The fratricide law cast its shadow everywhere inside the harem. Every mother of a prince understood that her son's brothers were, in the right circumstances, her son's enemies, and that she was therefore, by extension, the enemy of every other prince's mother. The harem was not poisoned by politics from outside, it generated its own politics from within, because the stakes inside it were as high as the stakes anywhere in the empire. Higher, perhaps, the throne itself passed through these rooms. And above Haseki, the word that describes the ark, the destination, the prize that a slave girl purchased in a distant market could, in theory, one day reach, was Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, the reigning Sultan's mother, the most powerful woman in the empire, full stop, and one of the most powerful people in the empire, regardless of gender. She controlled the harem, she commanded enormous revenues, she had the ear of her son in a way that no vizier could quite replicate, because no vizier had held him as an infant. Ambassadors sent her gifts, she administered vast religious endowments, she could unseat officials and influence appointments, and in certain periods she was not merely influential, but governing, because the Sultan was young, or weak, or confined to the Kafas too long, and someone had to run the machine. The woman who made this ascent most visibly, who broke the conventions of it so thoroughly that the empire is still arguing about her, was a girl whose origin historians still debate: Slavic, Ruthenian, Ukrainian. Some combination of origins from the wide, contested borderlands north of the Black Sea. She was taken, enslaved, and eventually entered the household of Suleiman, who would reign for 46 years and whom later centuries would call the Magnificent. Her name in the harem was Harem, which means something like the joyful one, the cheerful one, though she had been taken from her home and had no reason handed to her to be cheerful. What she was, by every account that survives, was extraordinarily capable. Suleiman did something almost unheard of. He married her. Not merely retained her as Haseki, not merely elevated her to the rank of acknowledged favourite, but contracted a legal marriage, the kind a free woman of standing might expect, not a slave. Why he did this is a question the historical record doesn't fully answer, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What the record does show is the result. Hurrem Sultan, formerly a slave girl from the borderlands, became the legal consort of the Sultan of an empire that stretched from Hungary to the Persian Gulf. She corresponded with foreign rulers, she commissioned mosques and charitable complexes. She intervened in the politics of succession in ways that shaped the dynasty for generations. She is the archetype of the ascent, the proof of concept that the harem's ladder was real, that you could begin at the bottom rung and not stop climbing. The period that historians call the Sultanate of Women ran roughly from the 1530s to the 1650s, and it is a genuine historical phenomenon, not a romantic exaggeration. Valid sultans and Hasekis exercised real political power over appointments, succession, and foreign affairs during these decades, partly because the sultans of this era were often young or ineffective, partly because the institutional position of the Valid Sultan had grown strong enough to function almost independently. The most formidable of them was Qasem Sultan, who navigated the reigns of a son and then grandsons, who corresponded directly with European powers, who administered her own revenues and her own patronage network, who was by any reasonable measure one of the most politically active figures the empire produced in the 17th century. She was murdered in the end. Power at the top of the Ottoman ladder always bent back toward that outcome: the silk cord, the overturned pilaf, the seal taken from around the neck. Qasem Sultan was killed in a palace power struggle in 1651, in the very harem where she had built her power over decades. The circumstances were violent and intimate in the way that only the inner rooms of the palace could be. She had climbed as high as it was possible to climb, and the climb ended the way so many climbs in this system ended, suddenly in the dark, at the hands of people who had decided the balance of power had shifted. This is the sensation that sits at the top of every Ottoman ladder. Not safety, not peace. The higher you climbed, the more of the world you commanded, and the more of the world was watching you, calculating whether you still commanded it. A captured girl from the borderlands could become the queen mother of an empire, and the queen mother of an empire could be killed in her own bedroom. Elevation and exposure were the same thing, always and at every rung. The air was thinner up there, the light was brighter, and the cord was always somewhere nearby. Past the harem's guarded threshold, controlling who crossed it, stood a figure whose position makes a particular kind of sense once you understand what the whole machine was built around. The Sla As, the Aga of the girls, which was the informal name, held the formal title of Dasadi As, the Aga of the House of Felicity, and he was the chief black eunuch, the commander of the African eunuchs who guarded the Sultan's inner household and the women inside it. By the later centuries of the empire, this man was one of the highest-ranking and wealthiest officials in the entire Ottoman state, and the logic of why is, once you see it, the same logic that ran through every other appointment in the system. He could not found a dynasty, he had no sons, he had no lineage that could threaten the Sultan's own. He was enslaved. He had arrived, like the Deverne boys and the harem carrier, from outside, typically from Africa, brought through Egypt, often castrated before reaching Ottoman territory, since Islamic law restricted the act within Ottoman lands. He was, in the most radical sense the system understood, rootless, and rootlessness, in the Ottoman calculus, was not a disqualification. It was the credential. The man who could not build a competing power structure was the man you trusted closest to the centre. The Sla As controlled physical access to the Sultan through the harem. He administered the enormous imperial religious endowments, the Waqfs, that supported the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which meant he controlled not just intimacy, but money. Enormous rivers of it, flowing through the most sacred institutions in the Islamic world. Ambassadors understood that to reach the Sultan, to influence the court, to understand what was happening inside the palace walls, one very useful door passed through the chief black eunuch. Access was power, and he held the access. Inside the palace, the spatial division was total. The third court, the Enderun, the palace school where the brightest Deverne boys were trained to become administrators and officials, was guarded by a different corps of eunuchs entirely. The Akala, the white eunuchs, led by their own Kapas. The palace thus mirrored itself across a single line. On one side, the male kul in training, future governors and commanders, guarded by white eunuchs. On the other, the female household, concubines and mothers of princes, guarded by black eunuchs. Two halves of the Sultan's total household, each with its own hierarchy, its own guards, its own internal ladder, separated by walls and corridors and the geography of absolute control. Both corps were enslaved. Both were rootless. Both held power through proximity and through the impossibility of passing that power to children. The same logic that made a Deverm boy from a Bulgarian village the safest person to give a province to was the logic that made a castrated African slave the safest person to put between the Sultan and everyone who wanted something from him. The machine was consistent. It kept returning to the same solution because the same solution kept working. Give power to the person who has nothing to gain by betraying you and everything to lose, and then own that person completely, so that even their nothing is yours. Step back now. Step out of the palace's innermost corridors, past the Akala in the third court, through the second court with its kitchens and stables and treasury offices, out through the imperial gate where the heads of the fallen were sometimes displayed, and the empire read the news of its own power in the arranged evidence of consequence. Step into the city, Istanbul, Constantinople before it was Istanbul, and Byzantium before it was Constantinople, a city that had been a capital for so long that its stones held the memory of every regime that had imagined itself the center of the world. The Ottomans organized the city, and the empire, along a principle that the dossiers rung, demands we slow down for: the millet. The word millet, in Ottoman usage, referred to a legally recognized confessional community, a group defined by its religion and granted internal self-governance within the empire's larger frame. The Orthodox Christians had their millet under the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, who sat in the Fana district and administered the community's religious and personal law, marriages, inheritance, community courts, and was held responsible by the Sultan for his flock's conduct and its taxes. The Armenian Christians had their millet under their own patriarch. The Jews had theirs under the chief rabbi, the Hahamba. Each community governed its internal affairs according to its own law. Each community's leader was answerable for the community's behavior and its obligations to the Ottoman state. This was not tolerance in the modern sense of the word. It was not the idea that all beliefs are equally valid and all people equally free. It was something more specific and more honest, a structured hierarchy of confessions in which the correct relationship to the Sultan and to the Islamic order of the state determined your legal status, your obligations, and your protections. Non-Muslims were dhimmi, or in Ottoman Turkish, zimmi, which translates as protected people. The word carried both the promise and the condition. You were protected. You could practice your religion, you could run your community courts and keep your records and pray in your own churches and synagogues. And in exchange for this protection, for the security of living under Ottoman rule rather than being expelled or forcibly converted, you paid the sizye, the poll tax that Muslims were not required to pay. The sizye was not merely symbolic. It was substantial and reliable, a major revenue stream for the treasury, and its logic was explicit: you were exempt from military service, which was an obligation and a burden for Muslims, and you paid a tax instead. Protection in exchange for money and a subordinate legal status. You were not equal, but you were recognized, and recognition meant the law could see you, could address you, could protect you within the limits it set. Whether this was a reasonable arrangement or an exploitative one, whether the people living under it experienced it as protection or as taxation enforced by the power asymmetry of empire, is a question the historical record answers differently depending on who was keeping the records and when. What the record does show with clarity is this: under the millet system, the Ottoman Empire became home to communities that had been expelled from elsewhere and found, In Istanbul and Salonika and throughout the empire's cities, something like a stable place to land. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain signed the Alhambra Decree expelling the Jewish community from Spain, a community that had lived there for generations, that had contributed to medicine and philosophy and trade and the preservation of texts in ways that the historical record has documented richly. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II accepted them. According to the accounts that survive, he is said to have remarked in the slightly sardonic register of a ruler receiving an unexpected gift that the Spanish monarchs had impoverished their own country to enrich his. The Sephardic Jews who arrived, Sephardic from the Hebrew for Spain, Sepharad, settled in the empire's cities and became prominent in trade and finance and medicine and diplomacy. They brought with them skills and networks and, crucially, the knowledge of languages and commercial relationships that connected the Ottoman economy to the wider Mediterranean world. They staffed the corps of translators on which Ottoman diplomacy depended. They introduced the printing press to the empire. In Salonika especially, they became so central to the city's economic life that the city essentially paused on their Sabbath. The zimmi status was a legal subordination. Yes, they paid the sizzi. They lived under status restrictions that varied in their enforcement over time and place. But within that frame, the Sephardic community built something durable and vibrant in the Ottoman world, and the empire was genuinely enriched by it. And this is the paradox the millet system shares with the Kul and the Deverm and the eunuch corps. The empire found its most useful people repeatedly in the people who came from outside it. The slave boys from the Balkans who ran the army and the bureaucracy. The carrier from the borderlands who became the Sultan's consort. The African eunuchs who guarded the inner palace. The Sephardic merchants who staffed the trading networks, the Greek interpreters who navigated the European courts. The empire's strength was, in significant part, its capacity to absorb people who had nowhere else to go and make them indispensable. Now look more carefully at what these people were wearing, because in the Ottoman world you did not need to ask a man his rank or his religion. You could see it. The sumptuary law, the kanun that governed dress, was as precise an instrument as the timar register or the sizzi ledger, and it organized the visual landscape of the street, the market, the court, the mosque, into a legible text that anyone who knew how to read it, and nearly everyone did, could pass at a glance. The master document of this visual grammar was the turban. Wound cloth over a kavuk cap, the turban was not merely headgear, it was a data point, a statement, a legal declaration made in fabric. Its size, its shape, the number of its folds, the ornamentation at its centre, these were not matters of personal taste. They were regulated, codified, enforced. The ulema, the religious scholars, wore turbans of a particular shape that announced their standing in the hierarchy of Islamic learning. High officials in the administration wore turbans that expressed their rank. Military officers wore headgear that distinguished them from civilians and from each other within the ranks. A sipahi's turban was different from a janissary's burq, which was different from the wrapped headgear of a merchant, which was different from the distinguishing markers non-Muslims were required to wear in certain periods and places. And the turbans followed you to your grave. In Ottoman cemeteries, and you can still find them today, the old ones, overgrown in places. Quiet in the way that only very old places are quiet, the headstones were topped with carved stone turbans, whose shape preserved in permanent form the exact rank and affiliation of the person beneath. A stone turban carved in the silhouette of an ulema's wrap marked the grave of a religious scholar. A different shape marked an official or a military man. The hierarchy that had been legible on the street was legible in the graveyard. Status followed you into death and remained, in stone, after everything else about you had dissolved. The empire needed to read you while you were alive. It insisted on being able to read you after. Colour did similar work. Certain colours carried associations that the law attempted to regulate, though regulation of colour was always somewhat harder than regulation of shape, because dyes faded and fashions shifted, and people with money found ways to approximate the restricted tones without technically violating the letter of the rule. Green was the most charged colour, carrying associations with the prophet, with the sacred, with the highest religious prestige, and was accordingly restricted in its most vivid form. The footwear told a story. At various points, the colour of your boots or shoes indicated your religion and your rank. Green boots were not for everyone. Red boots carried their own associations. Black and other muted tones were directed, in sumptuary edicts, toward those of lower status or different confession. The anxiety behind these regulations is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals what the empire understood about itself. The anxiety was not primarily about beauty or aesthetics. It was about legibility. If a wealthy merchant, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, could wear the same fabrics and the same colours and the same turban shape as a high official or a religious scholar, the visual grammar of the street broke down. And with it the social order the state needed everyone to be able to read. Money was the danger. Money could buy cloth, and cloth was the code. The muhtasib, the market inspector, whose office combined the roles of quality regulator and public morals enforcer, was responsible for catching those who dressed above their station, and edicts across the centuries record periodic crackdowns, moments when the state noticed that the code had blurred and moved to sharpen it again. The same muhtasib who verified the weights on a merchant's scales also verified that the merchant's headgear matched what the merchant was permitted to wear. All of this, the turban on the street and the carved stone turban in the cemetery, the green boots and the Sizier receipt and the cauldron on the parade ground, and the Meher Ihmayun seal worn around the neck, and the silk cord in the palace's inner rooms, all of it came down, finally, to the bottom of the ladder. To the riaya. The word is worth holding. Riaya means the flock, the shepherded ones. Those who attended, guided, taxed, protected, governed, as distinct from the asker, the military administrative class, the soldiers and officials and religious scholars who were tax-exempt and governed, the riaya were the taxed and the governed. Muslim and non-Muslim alike, peasant and artisan and merchant, the riaya were the productive population whose labour and whose grain and whose silver paid for everything above them. The fundamental social line in the Ottoman world was not the line between Muslim and non-Muslim, though that line was real and consequential. The deeper line was between those who collected taxes and those who paid them, between those who served the Sultan with arms or administration and those who served the Sultan with their harvests and their commerce. A peasant in a Balkan village, a craftsman in the covered markets of Istanbul, a weaver in Bursa, a spice merchant in Damascus, these were riaya. They organized themselves in the cities into guilds, the esnaf, with their own internal hierarchies of master and journeyman and apprentice, their own ceremonial lives, their own patron saints and ritual occasions, their own regulated prices, and their own standards of quality that the muhtasib enforced. The guilds were a whole ordered world operating beneath the state's direct notice, and yet essential to the cities that made the empire's trade possible. A master craftsman in his workshop, surrounded by his journeymen and his apprentices, was at the bottom of the imperial ladder and at the top of the guild's ladder, and both of those things were true simultaneously. The peasant in the village had a simpler ledger. He paid his dues to whoever held the revenue grant on his land, the Sipahi if the Timar system still held, the Miltezim's agents if the Iltisam had come, and he paid the Sizya if he was not Muslim, and he worked his fields in the seasons required, and he watched his sons grow and wondered, as parents have always wondered, what the world held for them. If an official arrived from Istanbul with a register and a measuring rod, and that official was part of a Deverm levy, the father might feel, depending on everything about him and his circumstances, terror or grief, or something more complicated that the historical record cannot fully recover, because the historical record was kept by literate officials and not by Balkan peasant fathers in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. What the record does preserve in its Ottoman political writings is the idea that connected all of this together. The phrase is Der Ayadlai, which translates as the circle of justice. And it was not a description of what the empire always achieved, but of what it understood itself to be striving toward. A theory of the state that Ottoman administrators and scholars set down in texts across the centuries. The circle worked like this: there is no sultan without soldiers. There are no soldiers without money. There is no money without a prosperous riaya. There is no prosperous riaya without justice. And there is no justice without a sultan who enforces it. The circle is complete, and every element depends on every other element, and the sultan's primary obligation, the thing that made him legitimate, the thing that the title Zillullah fil Lem asked him to be a shadow of, was to protect the riaya from those who would exploit them past the point of endurance. It is a beautiful idea. It is also an idea that the Ottoman state honoured inconsistently, as every state in history has honoured its own beautiful ideas inconsistently. The tax farmer who squeezed the village past its capacity to pay was a violation of the circle. The debasement of the ake that eroded the peasants' savings was a violation of the circle. The janissary, stationed in a provincial town, who extorted the local merchants was a violation of the circle. The empire knew this, which is why the petitions that flowed into Istanbul from the provinces, the complaints that landed on the divan's table, so often invoked the same language: we are your flock. We are the riaya, and we are being destroyed by those above us, and the law says the sultan must protect us. The riaya knew the theory too. They had heard it from the pulpit and the marketplace and the local Qadi's court often enough to know that it was the language the system understood. And so the ladder held, not because everyone on it was content, and not because the system was just in any absolute sense, but because the ladder was real, because the ranks and the obligations and the protections, however imperfectly enforced, were legible and known, and provided a framework within which people could make calculations about their lives. The Qadiye who learned her protocols and her languages understood what she was working toward. The Asimi Olan in the barracks knew the path from cadet to Orbak. The Timariot knew how many sebel his grant required, and what would happen to that grant if he failed to show for campaign. The millet community knew its Sizi obligation and its right to its own courts. The Esnaf master knew his guild's rules and his own position within them. Everyone on the ladder knew where they stood, and everyone could see, even if they could not reach, the rungs above. This is the thing that is easy to miss when you look at the Ottoman world from the outside and see only the strangeness, the slave elite, the harem's political power, the soup kettle as a signal of revolt, the carved turbans in the cemeteries. The strangeness is real. The inversion is real. Men legally enslaved, governing free ones, women purchased and renamed becoming co-rulers of an empire, a cauldron overturned being more politically significant than a drawn sword. All of that is true. But underneath the strangeness was a coherence, a mechanical logic that you can follow from the bottom, rung to the top and back again, and find consistent. The machine ran on a single idea, and the idea was this: ownership and dependence were the same thing as loyalty. A person who had been taken from their origins, from a Balkan village, from the African coast, from the borderlands north of the Black Sea, and who had no family network of their own, no independent estate, no ancestral name that commanded allegiance from anyone, was exactly the kind of person you could trust with a province or an army or the innermost chambers of the palace, because they had nothing and no one but the Sultan, because their elevation was entirely his gift and could be withdrawn with a gesture, because their children, if they had them, held no inherited claim, because they were, in the most complete sense the language offered, his. The free-born Muslim nobleman with his own land and his own clients and his own lineage was, paradoxically, less trustworthy than the slave who had none of those things. The landed cavalryman of the Timar could, in theory, look at his grant and his horses and his sebel and feel something like independence. The Janissary, stripped of family and trade and permanently bound to the barracks of his okak, had no such option. The Kariye elevated to Haseki was elevated precisely because the elevation was the Sultan's to give, not hers to claim. The eunuch in the innermost court had nothing to plot toward because he could leave nothing behind. The system was remarkably consistent once you understood what it was optimizing for. It was optimizing for loyalty. And the way you manufactured loyalty in the Ottoman theory of governance was to manufacture dependence. The way you manufactured dependence was to take people out of their original contexts and give them a new one that had only a single source. You, the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, the owner of the household that was also the state. The shadow fell then across everything, across the Janissary's spoon in his felt cap, a small silver gleam of the kitchen that was his only home, across the Timariot's grant document, the paper that made him a cavalryman instead of just a farmer, across the Multezim's ledger full of names and amounts and the arithmetic of extraction, across the harem's allowance lists, the daily stipends of coin dispersed by rank down the long corridor of women, across the sizzy receipts handed to the Dhimmi household, the proof that you had paid and were therefore protected for another year, across the turban on the street, wound in the shape that said, to anyone who cared to read it, here is who I am in this world's order. Across the carved stone turban in the cemetery, where the shape persisted after the man was gone, where the hierarchy that had organized the living continued to mark the dead, where the empire's need to legibility extended even to the grave, and across the village at dawn, the one in the Balkans, or in Anatolia, or in the Arab lands, where the family was already awake and already moving, because the grain would not wait, and the field did not care about the divan's deliberations or the cauldron's status as a political symbol, where a boy might be registered in a levy one morning and enrolled in the Assemi-Olan Corps by the following season, and his name would appear in a register in Istanbul, and the register would travel upward through the bureaucratic layers toward some scribe who would file it and not think twice, and where the family he left would continue to tend the field that fed the machine that his own hands might one day be trusted to run. This is where the whole ladder rested, in the end. Not on the silk cord or the Mercury Humayun seal or the marble of the Third Court. On the field, on the grain, on the daily, persistent labour of the Riaya, who were neither the most dramatic nor the most storied part of the Ottoman story, but who were its ground, its floor, the weight-bearing surface on which everything else was built. The Circle of Justice said that the Sultan must protect them. Some sultans tried, some failed. The empire, in its long centuries, encompassed both. The ladder is whole now. From the field at dawn to the palace's sealed inner court, from the carrier at the harem's base to the Valide Sultan in her apartments managing correspondence that reached foreign thrones, from the Asimiolan sleeping in the barracks to the Sadrazam carrying the seal that meant he ran the state. From the Dhimmi merchant tallying his sizya receipt to the Xlar Ars managing the vakfs of the holy cities, the whole structure is visible, and its logic is visible, and it is stranger and more coherent than almost any other arrangement of power in the medieval and early modern world. Strange, because it inverted what Western observers expected of power, not inherited nobility, not landed wealth, not family name, but the Sultan's household of slaves. Coherent, because the inversion was not an accident or a corruption, but a design, a solution to the problem that every large state faces, which is how to build loyalty at scale, how to prevent the men who hold your armies and your treasury and your provinces from turning those resources against you. The Ottoman answer was, remove their independent foundations, own them completely, elevate them into your household and make them dependent on that household for everything. Then govern the world through them. It worked for a very long time. The Timar gave way to the Iltisam, the Janissary Okak gave way to the Vaka-i Hayre, the Sultanate of Women passed into memory. The Kafes continued to produce sultans who emerged blinking into the daylight of the throne, sometimes ready, sometimes not. The empire persisted from the House of Osman's first uncertain decades, around 1299 until 1922, one of the longest reigning dynasties the world has seen, through which the same structural logic, elevation through ownership, power through dependence, ran like a thread through an enormously complex tapestry. That thread is the thing to carry with you now, as the palace's lights dim and the Bosphorus catches what remains of the evening. The thread is the answer to the question that the whole tour was built around, the question the ladder was always posing as you climbed from rung to rung. Why would a state give its highest offices to its slaves? Because ownership was the only credential the Sultan could fully trust. Because the slave had nothing and no one outside the Sultan's household, and nothing and no one was the qualification for everything and everything. Because, in the Ottoman theory of the world, rootlessness bred dependence, and dependence bred loyalty, and loyalty was the only material you could actually build an empire from. The great cauldron cools in the Okak's hearth. The seal hangs around no one's neck tonight. The turban in the cemetery holds its shape against the dark, patient as stone, marking a rank that the man who wore it cannot feel anymore. The field at the edge of the village is silent in the way that worked earth is silent, dense with everything it has given and everything it will give again. The harem's corridors are empty of footsteps. The corridor between the Third Court's enderun and the harem's guarded threshold holds no traffic at this hour. The Valide Sultan's apartments are still. The Xla Ars has made his last rounds. Somewhere in the city, in the quarter where the Sephardic merchants once sorted their spices, and the Orthodox Patriarch once kept his records in Greek, and the Muhtasib once checked the colour of a man's boots against the sumptuary register. The old stones hold the sediment of every arrangement of human power that has ever called this city its centre. It is a great deal to hold in a single city, and it is a great deal to hold in a single mind, and you are not required to hold all of it right now. Let the ladder go. Let the rungs settle back into the earth from which they were drawn, the grain that became the coin, that became the salary, that became the rank, that became the carved stone in the cemetery. Let it all settle. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.